Hey everyone, it's 8 Productions here. It's been a little while, but I'm back, and I wanted to make a video talking about the Railway Series styled engines that I've been making for the past year and a bit, and talk a little bit about why I made them and how I made them. But then I realised I've made 4 different versions of Thomas, so I should probably talk about those first, and then later on I can do a video about all the other engines. So that's what this video is. We're going to be chatting about the 4 different versions of Thomas that I made, why I made 4 of them, how I made them, and kind of what my plan is in terms of like which one I'm going to use for videos, which one's my favourite, that sort of stuff. So yeah, welcome to that video. That's what this is right now, what we're doing right now. Enjoy. My first thought process was to customise the body of a standard classic Thomas that could then be placed on either a Percy chassis or a Thomas chassis, depending on the style or time period I wanted to present. For those unfamiliar, in the story Thomas Comes to Breakfast, Thomas crashes into a house and subsequently has his buffer beam rebuilt without the slope. This was specifically done because Audrey didn't like that his buffer beam was uneven, even though the buffers still line up, like the back buffer beam is lower to accommodate, but anyway. I made minor modifications including separating his extended side tanks from his splashes, cutting a hole for the cab door, lengthening his funnel, and making actual divots in his coal bunker. I use a Dremel tool for most cutting jobs. I took the splashes from my RWS Henry, since they'd been removed. I also cut off the lamp mould and replaced it with a lamp iron, so I have more freedom to change his head codes. There was a bit of a gap in the plastic where the lamp was cut off, so I filled that with putty and smoothed it over with some sandpaper. I actually use lamp irons from spare Thomases, like the buffer beam on the back of my E2 Thomas, because that doesn't see the light of day under his cab. To cut them out, I use what I call a hot knife. I turn on the stove, put the blade over the fire until it gets hot, and I can slice right through the plastic. It melts the plastic as well a little bit as cutting it, which is why the edges look charred and curled up. I also use the hot knife technique to attempt to cut divots into his coal bunker. This didn't go so well, but I tried my best to sand down any sections where the plastic had curled up, and in some parts I had to use cardstock to replace bits that had fallen off. Lots of putty and sanding down was needed before it looked okay. Still not the best effort, in my opinion, but I'm happy I tried something a little extra to set this Thomas apart from the regular merchandise. I actually no longer have a gas cooktop, so I don't know how I'm going to do hot knife stuff in the future, but I'm also not going to ever recommend doing this because I don't want anyone to hurt themselves. There are plenty of other much safer ways and less hacky ways to cut plastic. I removed the original sticker decals with a rag dipped in eucalyptus oil, which helps to remove all the sticky residue. This prevents there from being any strange looking bumps on the engine, like this. Yuck. The funnel is just one of those lead weights that sits inside Thomy engines, and a small wire is wrapped around the top to make it look like the rim. I drilled a hole where his original funnel was, so I could slot the weight in and get it just right before gluing it in. After all the bodywork was done, I could paint them. I spray paint my engines these days, and I mostly use enamel-based Tamiya paints. I used the Tamiya TS undercoat, but then I used a different brand for his blue coat. There is an inexpensive brand of enamel paints called Aussie Export, naturally get them in Australia, which have a colour called Sky Blue, and this is almost identical to the blue that the merchandise uses. For the running board I use the Aussie Export's matte black. I tend to use a lot of matte black, so I tend to just buy the cheap brand for that colour. The cab roof and smoke box are Tamiya gloss black, and I used masking tape to cover any sections of the engine that I didn't want painted. I hand painted the undercarriage matte black with Humbrol enamel matte black. I hand paint the underside of the engines once the body is fully painted, and I'm not too stressed about how even the coat is. It's more just to draw attention away from the undercarriage, making it black, so then it's not as visible. When it's red, I think it's a bit distracting. And after a long history of proclaiming Posca markers to be my dearly wed, I actually decided to try hand painting the lining on my Thomases, so that the lining could be the same bright red as his buffer beam. The Posca markers tend to either look too pink or too dull. I ended up using Posca markers first so that I had a straight line that I could paint over. I used a ruler with the markers so that I knew it was straight, and then I could paint over it with the hand paint. I used Humbrol enamel bright red for that. Ultimately, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. It was incredibly time consuming and my back was very sore because I have terrible posture and I was leaning forward trying to paint as carefully as I could. But I think it was worth it. The numbers and builder's plates were printed on regular A4 paper, cut out as accurately as possible, and stuck on just with a regular glue stick. The trick to making the decals look seamless is to get a paint pan, or just a regular texter, and paint the edge of the paper so that you can't see that teeny weeny white strip from the edge of the paper, which really makes it look amateur, I suppose. But if you just paint the edge a little bit of red, then it blends it in and it makes it look like it's a proper sticker or something. His cab windows are pieces of masking tape that have been sprayed matte black and then cut out with a hole punch so that they're perfectly circular. The window sills are then painted on with hand paint. Then the windows can be just stuck on just like a sticker. And that's how I made the classic and the rebuilt versions of Thomas. These create a pretty accurate representation of the early Thomas illustrations, such as Kennedy's and Payne's. I think it best captures the classic Thomas look, though in some ways that makes it a little less visually striking, potentially a little bit boring. My classic Thomas uses this shell on a normal Thomas chassis, and the rebuild version has the same shell on a Percy chassis. I think I prefer the slope running board. It feels a bit more Thomasy, in my opinion. I don't know about you, but I hate Clive Spong's illustrations. He was consistent with how he drew the engines, I'll give him that, but I do not like how half of them look. What is with Percy's boiler? It looks like someone has stretched a photo too wide. Thomas is the worst. His front looks squished and flattened, his body is too square, it almost looks fat. But you know, despite my hate, I was curious to see how it would look if I made one. I happened to get my hands on a redesigned Trackmaster Thomas from like 2012, which I always felt looked so much like a Spong Thomas. This Trackmaster Thomas is actually longer than the standard Thomas, and his splashes don't even line up with the wheels. Once you notice that, you can't unnotice it. One thing I noticed about the Spong illustrations was how short his smokebox was. It made me realise just how long the Tomy smokebox is. It's actually kind of crazy. In addition to shortening the smokebox for the Spong Thomas, I also did the same for my other Thomases, because I felt it looked more accurate. This meant I needed to cut away the plastic in front of the battery compartment and bend the metal a bit, but a battery can still fit in. I honestly think this makes such a difference in making him look shorter. I know the Unlucky Tug and some others are really particular about Thomas being what they consider a baby E2, like an E2 but shorter. And I think for the Tomy model, all you really need to do is shorten that smokebox, and it makes him overall look a lot shorter. That'd be like the one thing. If you could only do one thing in making a custom Thomas, I'd recommend doing that for Tomy, just because it really changes how he looks. Just like my other Thomases, I added a taller funnel. Because I didn't modify anything else on this Thomas, I didn't need to repaint it, so it retains the original paint job and decals. I did add a builder's plate though, and I put it on his splasher to differentiate it from the other versions of Thomas who have it on his cab. This shell goes on the same Percy chassis as the rebuild Thomas. All my Thomases are a little bit interchangeable like that. Despite my hate for Spong's drawings, I actually quite like this Thomas for how unique it is, and how it specifically harkens to one of the illustrated styles. And finally, the E2 Thomas. This one is a funny one because, although Thomas is said to be a LBSC E2 class, we never really see him depicted properly as an E2, except in a couple of early illustrations that were redrawn. This Thomas is unique for its sloping footplate at the rear as well as the front. I used the shell from my very first Railway Series Thomas for this, since it already had the extended cab that accommodated for that lower footplate. Similar to my other Thomases, I separated the splashes from the side tanks and cut divots in the coal bunker. The divots are a bit different to the other Thomases, they're a bit more like an actual E2, but Thomas never actually looked like this. I used the normal length of smokebox for the E2 to imply that he is longer than the other versions of Thomas. I really like how they all kind of look different in their sizes, they all have different smokebox sizes. Yeah, it's just a bit of fun. I put this version's builder's plate on the centre of the running board like real E2s. I've realised that in my script I didn't really explain how I made the curved running board at the back, so I'll do that now. It's about how you'd expect to make it. This was once upon a time a Thomas chassis. I cut off the front of the running board with my Dremel tool, and I cut off the back of this one, and then I just glued it on. You can see here, I actually didn't realise this until filming, but there's a bit of a crack there, which is a bit unfortunate, but at least illustrates how I did it. So I cut here, and then I've stuck on the front of a Thomas running board here, and then I puttied it to smooth it over, but obviously on this side it's not very smooth. On the other side it's a little bit better. You can see the seam slightly there, but on the side you can't really tell. There was a little bit of other cutting that needed doing. Cut on the front here to make way for the back coupling, and then also cutting on the inside. You can see that it's not the cleanest bit of cutting, but that was just obviously to make room so it could fit around the motor. Yeah, that's how I made the sloped running board. And and then the body just sits on top like that. Yeah, okay, back to the properly edited video. For me, seeing Thomas as a realistic E2 was always a little bit jarring. I always preferred Buckman's version over Hornby's, but I actually really do like the extra details that come with this type of Thomas, like the curve lining and the coal bunker rails that are unique. And you can even add a Westinghouse pump for that extra level of fancy. I think this version works best for the Tomy chassis because it's so long. It's more like an E2. He doesn't look quite as stretched out. The fun thing about these Thomases is that they're very interchangeable. You can kind of just put different bodies on different chassis and so on, you know, which is really fun. And the main reason why I made so many versions of Thomas was because I'm so indecisive. I didn't really know what like my definitive version of Thomas looks like. So I made like 4 different versions. Originally, my thought process was to have different Thomases for different time periods. So when he first came to the island, he probably would have looked like a real E2. And then they like cut him down to size a little bit so he gets a bit shorter, and then has no slope at the back, just only has one at the front. The more I think about it, the more I think I actually just like the E2 version of Thomas. I like how unique it is for a Trackmaster engine. You don't really see many that look like this, and it's a bit more eye-catching. And it also emphasises that he's bigger than Percy and Toby, which I really like. But I'd love to hear what your favourite Thomas was out of these ones, or what your favourite one is generally, if you have your own alternate canon about what sort of engine he is. I love chatting about that sort of stuff, so I'd love to hear about that in the comments, so that'd be really good. If YouTube could not turn off comments, that would be pretty swell, so then we could actually do that. Yeah. But thanks so much for watching. If you've sat through all of this, I really appreciate that. I'm planning on doing more of these like rambly sort of videos, because I want to talk about my customs that I've made. Like obviously I want to do one where I chat about all the other engines, so Edward and Gordon and Henry and all that. So yeah, let me know if you like this sort of video, because I do want to do more of them. Yeah, hopefully you don't hate it. Yeah, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.